Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Scholar's Nook, where we offer mindful tips for the budding scholar. I'm Dr. Nick Wolf, and again, joining me is Dr. Stephen Lindenberger. And
Hello.
together, we're glad you're here. Stephen, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Nick. I look forward to our discussion today.
Awesome. Today, we're tackling the subject of definitions. It's been my experience, and Stephen, you may agree, that a major stumbling block of new scholars is how to properly define terms at the outset of a research study or a discussion. And given that, we should practice what we preach. So let's begin by me asking you, what is a definition, Stephen?
Well, a definition, first of all, I couldn't agree with you more. It's something we need to focus on in our scholarly writing. Before I define it, though, I want to say that for students who have ever written a paper where they get feedback from me or any of their other professors about this, it's probably going to be very familiar. And before I explain what definitions are, I want to remind our listeners that first and foremost, we should never assume that the reader either is familiar with the definition or can define a term or a construct, in their own mind. But we need to, when we provide definitions and construct clarity, we're basically saying to the reader, look, I've looked at the literature on this. There might be multiple definitions of a construct or a theory or a concept, but this is the one I'm using, and this is why, and cite the source. And today, one of the main things I'm focusing on with my comments is a wonderful essay written by Sotheby in the Academy of Management Review back in 2010. And it's an editor comment, and it's entitled Construct Clarity in Theories of Management and Organizations. And he, right out of the gate, says one of the reasons that a lot of papers get rejected, or the majority of the feedback that authors receive when they submit a paper, is lack of construct clarity and definitional parsimony. Definitional parsimony means being able to define something in a few words, which actually shows other researchers, other scholars, colleagues in your classes that you know what you're talking about. I love that old saying from Einstein, if you can't say it in a few words, you don't know it very well. And that's what they're getting at here, is to have an informed, parsimonious definition. So,
Just to quickly jump in here, that I totally agree how important it is to have concept clarity and have our terms defined, because I've frequently seen people, when people are more prone to talk past one another, usually that is based upon the fact we have not agreed upon our terms at the outset. In order to get resolution on issues, we have to understand what the person is trying to say, and we're using the same language to talk about our problems. Last week, was observing on the internet, which there's always one or two disagreements going on the internet at any one time, and there are two folks who are arguing the distinctions between, let's say, capitalism and socialism. And as they were fleshing out their discussions, they both seemed to be identical in terms of the practical effects of what they wanted. They both wanted to eliminate corruption of against people who they thought that were in power, and to provide more voice for the worker in the workplace. But they couldn't get past each other to build common ground because they wouldn't agree upon what the terms socialism and capitalism meant. So this is a real big problem.
right, absolutely. And you point to the problem at the social level, the social science level, the sociology level. It's really, really important. I digress just for a moment, but I recently read an article in the Atlantic Monthly that said that because of this lack of agreement on definitions and understanding each other's point of view, we've become like Babel. The story in the Bible where we're really being hindered by our lack of being able to communicate effectively with one another. And you cannot complete a project or move forward if everybody's speaking a different language and you can't understand each other. Interestingly, we're all speaking English pretty much, yet we don't understand each other. It really is quite perplexing and a very important issue. Um, I'm going to go back and try to answer your question using what Sotheby says here. A good definition should accomplish several tasks, and I'm quoting. First, the definitions should effectively capture the essence, or pardon me, capture the essential properties and characteristics of the concept or phenomena under consideration. So the essential properties and characteristics of the phenomena. Second, a good definition should avoid circularity. This occurs when a theorist uses elements of the term being defined in the definition or incorporates antecedent or outcome variables as part of his or her definition. And I love this example that he provides here. Thus, defining transformational leadership as a leader who transforms organizations is an empty definition because it uses the constructs in the definition. So I think that's a wonderful example. And all of us who have to write at the doctoral level, or we're starting to write at the doctoral level, we think we don't see anything wrong with this, obviously, as we're writing. But this is a place that'll get you kind of hung up in scholarly writing. You have to make sure that you are not using antecedents or outcome variables in the definition. And third, a good definition should be parsimonious. So we've already talked about that. It should try to capture as concisely as possible the essential characteristics of the phenomenon or concept. On the one hand, the definition should focus on the meaning of the term as narrowly as possible. On the other hand, there is a danger of overshooting the mark, offering a construct definition that is so narrow it lacks relevance and cannot be generalized.
I totally agree with that. Those are three amazing aspects of what a good definition is. And I always jump back to when I first start working with some students who come to my courses. They often struggle with definitions. They confuse a definition with descriptors. And to illustrate this, I often will jump in and say, how would you describe a desert? People would often come up with, well, dry, hot, sandy. You'll see the occasional cactus, otherwise pretty barren of life. And when we confuse descriptors with the definition, we can really get ourselves into trouble because beaches are hot and sandy.
Yeah.
Hot and dry could describe my oven.
Yeah.
So you can buy a cactus at a nursery. You need to really focus in and be more specific in what your definition really is. So do you know what the definition is of a desert, Stephen?
Probably has something to do with land that receives a minimal amount of precipitation. I don't know what the cutoff is.
That's correct. It's a desert is a geographical area that receives less than, on average, 10 inches of precipitation in a calendar year.
Sure.
If you have a precise definition, you now know a lot about in specificity what it is you're talking about, and that is a very useful tool to help us to agree upon terms to begin a conversation about anything. And I think that's what we need to emphasize is we need to, as you say, and your reference says here, that we need to have a specific, parsimonious, and well-defined definition to begin our sense making.
Yeah, and to, if you will, put a stake in the sand, and I've been using, it's so funny you use that desert definition because this week I've been using that metaphor of good definition places a stake in the sand, or draws a line in the sand. So, and we didn't rehearse this, so that's really cool. But yeah, those are really good examples. And in organizational sciences and business, one of the things that we struggle with the most is communication. You've done consulting, I've done consulting. We read a lot of papers from our students who are describing problems in organizations, and communication has got to be number one on the bandwagon for problems and source of conflict. And, you know, a lot of it is because we have, and I see this almost in every context that I'm in, that there's no background, there's no context. When people start talking about something, we tend to use a lot of acronyms in our organizations and assume everybody knows what we're talking about. Um, you know, I feel like many times I'm just jumping in the middle of a conversation because no background or context has been developed. And it's very similar to what we're talking about here, is being able to, you know, clearly state where you're coming from and how you're seeing the world based on your experience, that the other person can really either match that or challenge it effectively.
It comes to, as you say, different experiences, because not everything, having a good definition can help sort through the wheat from the chaff. Do you know what the largest desert in the world is?
Uh, the Gobi Desert.
Actually, the largest desert in the world is the Antarctic desert.
It is. I knew that was a trick question. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it.
It's actually 50% larger than the Sahara. So
Yeah.
so a lot of what the popular understanding of things is not accurate. So it's important to have a good definition about it. And I guess that leads into a next idea here. Not everything fits neatly into definitions. How would you go, or what should we do about dealing with exceptions? You know, well, some might say that, let's say, humans have 5 fingers in a hand, but yet some people are born with 4 fingers or 6 fingers on a hand. Does not make them inhuman. So how do we contend with the exceptions to our rules?
Well, I actually think that it's kind of going back to what I just said about providing context. And I'm looking here at the scope conditions in this. It's a subheading called scope conditions in the Sotheby article, and it speaks to what you're saying here, Nick. In contrast to physical sciences, few constructs in organization theory have universal applications. So most constructs, and like you're talking about, actually have universal application. There's always an exception. Rather, organizational constructs tend to be highly sensitive to and contingent on contextual conditions. So, for example, construct development from research on large publicly traded corporations may have little relevance for closely held corporations or family businesses. So the only way we can deal with the exceptions is really knowing where the other person's coming from, their context. You know, one time I was talking to someone here at work, and they were trying to compare a boss that they had in a previous job, was comparing him to Stalin. And I said, oh, hold on a second. You know, this is way out of context, way out of whack, not even close. You know, so we have to be very, very careful in the organizational sciences that this comes into the whole levels of analysis. Also, are you studying a phenomena at the organizational level? Are you studying at the group level or the individual level? And then that helps kind of reduce the differences. Wouldn't you agree, Nick?
Oh, totally. You know, there's a place for hyperbole, but definitely
Yeah.
doesn't belong in doing
Writing.
research. that's that is really an important distinction to make there. At the same point, you know, there is the wonder of human variation, and how there are very few hard and fast rules that apply across so many individuals, because everybody is so uniquely different. And that doesn't mean that you can't take the law of large numbers, shall we say, to identify patterns that are predominant, and therefore can guide our sense making in the general. And as you say, any prediction that we can make at the group level falls apart at the individual level, because individuals are always there to confound our predictions, because people are very, very different.
That is so true. And you know, as you were saying that, something popped into my mind that we need to take in consideration too. You know, the individual level, which is can be made up of different cultures too. So, like something that makes sense and applies like in a North American context or Western context may or may not apply, you know, in other contexts or other cultures. You know, you look at extroversion, for example, that's a highly coveted trait or has been. It's not as much as it used to be in the leadership literature. It was shown to be fairly predictive of leadership emergence, not so much success though. But you take that same construct and move it to an Asian culture where extroversion is actually works against you because it looks prideful, it looks boastful, it's, you know, it's a individualistic um, trait as opposed to a collective trait, and so it would work against us. Cultures don't see things in the same rational, uber rational way that we. And by the way, rationality, empiricism, positivism is only one. They're ways of looking at the world. It doesn't mean they're absolutely, you know, true as you know, compared to other things. So you look at other cultures. I was watching this documentary with my wife on UFOs the other night and about and I don't know how I feel about all this stuff, but I'm fascinated by the phenomenon of it. And there was an incident in Mexico, and they were talking to some of the locals who had seen this apparent appearance of a UFO, and they were talking about how, you know, in the Mexican culture, they're much more open to things that they don't understand. They don't have to explain every single thing. They can just let some things be. It can be a mystery. It can just be kind of taken on faith. Whereas in the US, we can't really handle that. You know, we don't have a very high tolerance for unanswered questions. We have to have an answer. We don't live with that ambiguity very well in this culture.
There's a lot there. A couple of things. First of all, as you say, that there are different cultural norms and expectations and understandings. And since a lot of our social science research grew out of the Western context, a lot of what we originally thought were universal ideas and beliefs and values, as we delved more into different cultures, we found that they weren't quite as universal. So the threshold to actually postulate universals is a lot higher and requires us to do the comparative analysis to see, really, is this something that is a human belief or a human construct, or is it more of a group, or is it more locally and parochial perspective? And
Right.
both are fine.
Yeah.
You see, about the idea about positivism, I would say, and this we've discussed this before, I believe, where quantitative analysis is very good about showing the predominance of something that exists in large numbers, but it's not very good about picking out the smaller stories or the less common stories, which are just as true, but they may not be as predominant.
Right.
And the burden of proof in quantitative work necessarily will squelch the other truths out there that are hard to find because maybe they're not nearly as predominant as other forms of truth. So I think absolutely right. We must appreciate positivism of being able to use empirical methods, but also realize that that's never the whole story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I also wanted to point out, again, from the Academy of Management Review, the Sotheby editorial here on page 352, he has a subheading called Clarity Facilitates Communications, or Communication. And I think that's really at the crux of it again, you know, being able to really communicate clearly, unambiguously, if you will. That's, I think, really important. And he says that this is Sotheby again, direct quote. Construct clarity allows us to build on prior research by providing the research community with a common language. And I think that's very, very important. A common language is an essential prerequisite for a community of scholars interested in the same or similar phenomena to exchange ideas and build knowledge. So, in other words, we all have to be on the same page. And we can only do that if we have construct clarity. And as I said before, this is a definition I'm using, this is why, and then it becomes a starting point for that communication.
And another aspect here that I think is important to explore here is that our concepts and our constructs must be discriminate. We've made some mistakes in the past. You consider concepts like motivation and engagement, or commitment and person organizational fit. There is a lot of overlap in these constructs. And the fact that we have a hard time assessing out the differences between these concepts is our mistake as scholars. And we really need to pay attention to figure out what is in this bin and what is outside this bin, because the more we always get excited about the new idea, the new concept. So we always try to write in our articles the new thing, but we often will overlook the fact that this concept looks a lot like the other one here, but I still want to get my name in print. And that's part of the pressures that we are dealing with as scholars.
Yeah. One of my mentors, that's a really great point. It's going to lead perfectly to my next thought here. One of my mentors, Dr. Ernie Stark, who is an amazing scholar, used to say, and there's a quote in this article, that what you just described, Nick, is basically putting old wine in new bottles. So we think we've got something new, and we've actually just come up for a different name. They go on to say in this article that Truman Kelly, one of the founders of the Stanford Achievement Test, called the proliferation of different labels for the same underlying construct the jangle fallacy. And so
Yeah.
I think that's really good. We have to watch it. Words matter. Dr. Poplar, who teaches in our DBA and PCAP programs, he talks about that all the time. Words really matter. They're not just words. Yeah, I think I mentioned this in our last podcast. We are doing a project at Creighton School of Medicine, developing an ongoing leadership course for medical students that everybody has to take. It's credit bearing. And that's our number one job, is to define leadership for them. And that definition shows up on the top of every presentation. It's on everything we put out. Don't forget, our definition of leadership is the dynamic process of helping a group achieve a common goal. All right. And so we go back to that transformation. A transformational leadership is someone who transforms followers, right?
Yeah.
Well, you take the other definition I just used, and we use at Creighton, and it's the standard definition of leadership, that it's a dynamic process. Right off the bat, you've got a really interesting thing to think about. Dynamic process. It's constantly changing. There's so many variables involved in it, and achieving, using a group to achieve a common goal. So we've moved it to the collective or group level of analysis, and then an actual outcome that we can expect from it, which is the achievement of a common goal. So that also shows us that leadership, we always talk about, you can't have a leader without followers. That immediately makes it a collective process. And yet we tend to look at leadership as a person. This is another hot topic for me, where, leadership says, or our organization's leadership says. It's like, no, leadership is a process, not a person. We really conflate that and confound it in the leadership research, especially. And I probably give more feedback on that one thing more than anything, is that leadership is a process. Leader is a person that's part of that process. So that's one little example for you.
I get that. A
Do you
moment ago,
agree?
you were discussing change and how how vital it is important to our deliberations. Sometimes, and we always want to make a point to, again, leave a bit of space for the person who's the heretic, or who comes from the different point of view. And that raises the idea, at some point in our scholarship, we may offer either a novel definition, or a definition that kind of approaches or tries to attack the definition and redefine a term in a different new way. So can you discuss with me a little bit about how you go about proposing what I would term a provisional definition?
Well, first of all, I don't like the word heretic. I like the word the term devil's advocate better, because I think,
Sure.
like in history, and again, here we are with definitions, we're getting into semantics, but a devil's advocate is actually part of the group, and they're there they serve a purpose to, push back against the conventional wisdom, right? Whereas a heretic is someone who probably their point of view won't be considered because they're outside the norm, and they're perhaps a threat to the orthodoxy.
Well, and then the reason why I termed it heretic is because I want to deliberately make space for those who would, under normal circumstances, be excluded from the discussion.
Okay. Point taken. Got you. Okay. So what's the question you asked me?
How would you go about proposing a provisional definition for the purpose of your scholarship, which may be unconventional or novel?
First of all, I would think about the reason of why we would need a provisional definition. And I guess I hope I'm answering your question, Nick, but to me, the provisional definition would be put in place because you're studying in a novel situation, or a unique setting where the normal definition pushes against that context norm, that the norms of that context. Am I making sense?
Totally. It's sometimes when we look at a situation, a fresh perspective will call into question the prevailing definition, at which point suggesting an alternative view is something that needs to happen in order to, I would say, make the logic of your paper work, of your article work. That's what I was suggesting.
Yeah. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I hopefully this works. And if it doesn't, you'll reel me back in. But I think of the word spirituality. Within a religious context, that takes on a meaning. It's more of kind of like a ritualistic or adherence to spiritual guidance or rules in a religion. Whereas if you take it outside of a specific belief structure and just think of spiritualism as connectedness and meaning, then it applies in both contexts. Because that's what a lot of religions are trying to achieve, or they're maybe that's not the goal of spiritualism, but that's what the power of spiritualism, the connectedness and the meaning, help propel the person into a deeper understanding or a deeper faith or a deeper purpose.
I think there's a lot there. I think that aligns quite well with what I'm trying to get at here with the question. You think about Adam Smith when he was talking about the Wealth of Nations, how we recontextualized greed or selfishness as a way, as a means to get to greater benevolence. That required a different take, which so we need to look at this at human desire from an alternative point of view that's not necessarily selfish. It
Right.
just means it's a way. So, but in order to even to entertain that idea, you had to stipulate that maybe, at least for the purposes of this discussion, let's just consider this is a possibility, and allow me to make my argument. And at the end of it, you can agree with it or not, but at least allow me to make my point.
Right. Right. I think that's fair. I think that's completely fair. And we need to be able to do that within in organizational research, the construct of empathy. This is a biggie, and it's something I wrote about in a paper I did called More Than Rocket Science. This researcher and writer Edwin Friedman, who wrote the book Leadership in the Age of the Quick Fix, Failure of Nerve, Leadership in the Age of the Quick Fix. And he really takes a lot of shots at the word empathy. He says that we shouldn't be using that in an organizational context, or even really, then this flies in the face of what clinical counselors say and behavioral scientists, that if you have a lack of empathy, then you're a sociopath or a narcissist, right? Well,
Yeah.
Friedman pointed out that the word empathy didn't even come into existence until like the 1920s or the 19 teens, and it was based on a German word which I can't pronounce that uh, was used to describe the way a person feels when they look at a work of art. It was for art, not for human interaction.
Hmm.
So how do I feel when I look at this? What's the experience of feeling in this piece of art? Well, you stop and think about it, and we use empathy to empathize with a sociopath. That's a bad thing. You don't want to feel in the
Yeah.
sociopath's experience. So that's something I really want to push for in the leadership field and the organizational sciences, is to let's stop and let's talk about the word empathy. We're not saying that you shouldn't have compassion, and I think that's the word that we're talking about. We should be replace empathy with compassion, because I think empathy, again, it wasn't even intended to describe human interaction. It was our interaction with an inanimate object, and when you try to apply that to human relations, that gets really, really dicey.
There's two more illustrations that come to my mind here. The trait disagreeableness or agreeableness.
Yeah,
As you know, in leadership, a lot of times those who are more disagreeable become better leaders
absolutely.
because they're able to challenge and to call out what's not working, and much more able to do that more freely. So, and even though that might go contrary to more human relations thought.
Yeah,
It's a good idea to at least look for. There's a place for multiple approaches to this thing. I have a
absolutely.
I have a student who has he's proposing on the concept of micromanagement, and he's taking a very dim view of micromanagement, and he's walking into the study having a bias against that concept. And I was trying to get him to think about, is there ever a time when a more directive style of leadership is appropriate? And the answer to that is, of course, there absolutely is. But getting my student to appreciate that and to consider that and to wrap that idea into his proposal, it took some doing for me to actually get him to reframe his thoughts around the idea.
Right. That's good. If we go back to agreeableness real quick, that construct is part of the big five,
Yep.
right? Which is openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and eroticism or emotional stability.
Mhm.
Agreeableness, other than neuroticism, which is highly negatively correlated to leadership emergence and effectiveness, agreeableness is second least predictive. Highly agreeable people, on the one hand, like you say, it seems like it would be a desirable trait, but in a leadership context, it could lead to poor outcomes. Like a highly agreeable person tends not to be a very good negotiator.
Yep.
We've seen the research on toxic positivity and affect. The better our affect is, the more agreeable we are, the less time we take to actually delve into decision making and so on. So on the face of it, it looks like it would be a good thing, but in reality, it often works against a leader.
Well, but it's also good in other contexts too. It does help with team building. So it
True.
depends. It depends upon how you're employing these skills. and in what
Right.
context.
Right. Good point.
Interesting.
Couple of final thoughts here.
Sure.
From Sotheby, why do we need construct clarity? I'm just going to read the bullet points here. Clarity assists empirical analysis. I think we've said that. We know what we're studying. We know, if we have construct clarity, we know what we're talking about and what we're not talking about, right? So it helps with empirical analysis. It enhances creativity. Constructs are carefully articulated abstractions that, if effectively crafted, expand the range of phenomena and relationships they capture. So that's a very creative part of it. Those are the main reasons they say that we need construct clarity. Any thoughts on those 2 points, Nick? Clarity assists empirical analysis, and construct clarity enhances creativity.
Well, obviously, on the creativity thing, it really is what I have found is that the more boundaries and guardrails you put on your thoughts, the more that drives your creativity. It seems to be a contradiction, but you think about it, if it's in order to do more with less, you need to have the less. And the closer you make the boundaries, the fewer resources you provide to a situation, the more creative your solutions have to be to get to the same outcomes.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. It really promotes resourcefulness. It promotes, resourceful and creative thinking for sure.
And as far as the empirical analysis, obviously, you must know what you have to measure in order to have in order to make clear measures of those variables. So absolutely, you need to have both of those things. And the more carefully you define your terms, your variables, your experiments, the less sloppy your methods are going to be as a result.
Absolutely. Well, for my part, I think, I really did lean heavily on this article, the Sotheby article, which I do include in several of my PCAP classes. And I just, for our listeners, want to reiterate that, I mean, it's a fascinating read. And it also, I think it wasn't in this article, but another one where he talked about the importance of developmental feedback, like when you submit journals or you're grading papers, or critiquing your colleagues' work. It should be developmental in tone and not just a chance for you to show that reader what you know about something, which he said it really irritates him. So this guy, Sotheby or Sotheby, however you pronounce his name, is really struck a chord with me when he was editor of the Academy of Management Review, which is where this article's from. 2010, it's volume 35, number 3, pages 346 through 357. And again, the title is Editor's Comment, Construct Clarity and Theories of Management and Organization.
Well, thank you so much for bringing that resource. I hope our listeners will check out the article. What you've told me, it definitely sounds to be very informative. And obviously it spurs a lot of discussion, as we can just illustrate.
Very good.
Stephen, anything else to wrap up?
No, I just want to say what a great time it is to kick these ideas around with you, Nick. I hope our listeners enjoy it as much as I have. And thank you so much for producing the show.
Okay, and this is where I hope Stephen remembers our tagline here. So until next time, folks, this is Nick and Stephen reminding you to think better.
Better. I'll get it perfect next time, Nick.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you.